Spence Field sits at approximately 4,900 feet above sea level, on the long ridge that forms the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. In June, the grassy bald is open and wide, the kind of place that surprises you after a climb through dense forest, a clearing that seems too large and too bright for the mountain it sits on, the meadow grass moving in the elevation breeze, the sky closer than it has any right to be. The Appalachian Trail runs through it. The forest begins again at the edges, abrupt and complete, the hardwoods in full summer leaf, the transition from open meadow to closed canopy happening within a single step. It was on this meadow, on the afternoon of June 14th, 1969, that the Martin family of Knoxville, Tennessee, had settled in for Father's Day weekend. The day was a Saturday. The season was early summer, the grass green and long, the afternoon light falling across the open bald at the unhurried angle of a June afternoon in the southern Appalachians, that particular quality of light that belongs to high elevations in the warmer months, clear and whole and steady, without the sharp shadows of lower ground. The family had come to the backcountry as they had come before, knowing the terrain with the ease of people who had made this particular journey more than once. Dennis Lloyd Martin was 6 years old. He was the youngest child in the family, the one whose age placed him at that stage of boyhood where the world is still primarily a physical thing, a place of grass to run through, forest edges to peer into, adults to dart away from and return to, the whole landscape organized around the simple pleasure of movement and surprise. His father, Bill Martin, was with the family. His grandfather, Clyde Martin, was with them too. His older brother, Doug, was there, old enough to know the meadow's edges, old enough to be given a little more range, old enough to be in charge of a small group of boys who had arrived at an idea. The Martins were not strangers to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They had visited before, and the comfort of returning to a familiar place was part of what the weekend held. The particular ease of a landscape that had already been walked, the trails already known, the elevation already accounted for. Spence Field was a destination they had chosen with deliberateness. A high camp along the Appalachian Trail, the grassy bald, offering a wide open space that a family with children could settle into without the closed-in pressure of deep forest on all sides. The meadow gave room, it gave light, it gave the specific pleasure of sitting in an open high place, with the forest held at a visible distance, the tree line marking where the world changed, but not yet demanding that anyone cross into it. The afternoon had been comfortable in the way that family camping afternoons often are in June in the mountains. The elevation kept the air cool enough to move in easily, the sky wide above the open bald, the surrounding forest providing the background presence of somewhere larger and older than the meadow itself. Other campers were at Spence Field that weekend. The Appalachian Trail corridor drew hikers and backpackers, and the bald served as a natural gathering point along the ridge, a place where different groups might find themselves in proximity without necessarily sharing a camp. Other families were there, other children were there. The meadow held more than one small group of people on that particular afternoon in June 1969, and was at some point in the late afternoon, Dennis and a small group of boys arrived at an idea. The group included his older brother Doug and 2 children from another family who had also made camp at Spence Field. The idea was simple in the way that the ideas of boys often are, rooted in the pleasure of surprise, in the logic of a game, in the mild mischief of doing something the adults did not expect. The boys would separate. They would move in different arcs toward the forest at the edge of the meadow. They would enter the tree line, move through the woods along the edge of the bald, and then emerge at an unexpected point to surprise the adults waiting in the open. It was the kind of plan that requires no complicated instructions, only a direction and a general agreement about where to end up. The meadow grass at Spence Field is tall enough in June to move with a person's passage through it, the blades bending and springing back, the ground beneath them firm and slightly uneven with the root systems of old turf moving through that grass toward the forest edge, and a group of boys would have been visible for a time, figures crossing the open bald in the afternoon light, their path toward the tree line obvious from the meadow's center, the forest waiting ahead of them at the boundary where the grass ended and the canopy began. The tree line at Spence Field is not a gradual transition. It is a sharp one. The meadow ends and the forest starts, and the interior closes immediately behind anyone who steps into it. The boys moved. They crossed toward the tree line, and they separated as the plan required, each arc taking a different approach toward the woods. Dennis moved with the group, and then, as the plan unfolded, moved toward the forest edge on his own approach. The time was somewhere between 4:30 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the June light still full across the meadow, still hours before dark at this time of year and this elevation. The afternoon had not yet begun to lengthen toward evening, or was only just beginning to, the light still high and clear and warm on the open bald. Dennis Martin, age 6, stepped toward the tree line at the edge of Spence Field, and then he stepped into it, and the forest closed around him the way it closes around anyone who crosses that boundary. The other boys came out. They emerged from different points along the tree line edge, completing the prank, arriving in the meadow from an unexpected direction as the plan had specified. The adults in the group reacted as adults react to a sudden appearance, the mild surprise of it, the recognition of the game, the laughter or exclamation that follows a successful prank. The boys had done what they set out to do, and then, in the natural accounting that follows any such game, it became apparent that not everyone had emerged. One of the boys had not come out of the forest with the others. Dennis had not appeared. The wait was brief before it became something else, a few minutes perhaps, long enough for the expectation of his arrival to shift into the first question, where is he? Why hasn't he come out yet? And then into the beginning of concern. His father began calling his name, Clyde Martin. His grandfather joined in. The calls went toward the tree line from the open meadow, carrying across the grass and into the edge of the forest, directed at the boundary where the boy had been last seen entering the woods. The forest edge absorbed the sound of the calls, as forest edges do, the names going in, the trees offering nothing back. The simplest explanation was the first one reached for. He was still in the woods, still moving, slightly slower than the others, perhaps turned around in the trees, perhaps delayed by undergrowth. A 6-year-old in a forest moves at his own pace, and the forest at the edge of Spence Field is not a tended park, but a genuine wilderness edge, the undergrowth thick and the footing uneven, and the directional sense that comes easily in an open space, much harder to maintain once the canopy closes above. He would emerge. He was simply taking longer than the others had taken. Bill Martin and Clyde Martin moved toward the tree line, calling the name, and moved into the forest edge themselves, still calling, still expecting to hear a child's voice, or to see a small figure pushing through the undergrowth toward them. Other campers at Spence Field joined the search, as people at a backcountry camp will, when a child's name is being called with a certain tone. The word moved through the groups gathered on and around the bald. A child had not come out of the forest. A 6-year-old boy. He had been at the edge of the meadow only minutes ago, and now he was not answering, and the forest was not giving him back. The searchers who were present spread out along the tree line and into the immediate forest edge, moving in different directions from the point where Dennis had last been seen, calling his name into the trees, listening, moving forward, listening again. The afternoon continued its slow progress toward evening. The search at the edge of Spence Field, conducted by Bill Martin and Clyde Martin, and the other campers who had joined them, extended into the forest and along the meadow's perimeter. The names called carried into the trees and returned no answer. The forest around Spence Field is deep in every direction. From the bald's edge, steep drainages descending toward creek bottoms, dense undergrowth at mid-elevation, the kind of terrain that closes around a path as soon as the path is left behind. The searchers moved into it as far as they could in the time available and found nothing to indicate which direction the boy had gone. Word came down from the mountain. Sometime in the evening of June 14th, 1969, the report of a missing child reached National Park Service rangers below, and the formal response began its initial motion. The notification, the beginning of the mobilization, the first steps of what would become one of the largest search and rescue operations the National Park System had mounted to that point. But that mobilization was still taking its first shape when the afternoon at Spence Field came to rest at the edge of a forest that had not answered. The meadow at Spence Field on a June afternoon is an open place, and a child crossing it toward the forest edge would have been visible for most of that crossing. There is no obstruction in the open bald, no depression or fold in the ground that conceals a figure moving through the grass, no interruption of the sight line between the center of the meadow and the tree line at its perimeter. The boys moving through that grass toward the forest would have been visible until they were not, until the tree line received them and the canopy closed, and the open space's sightline reached its limit at the forest boundary, the last confirmed view of Dennis Martin that the record documents places him at that boundary, crossing into the trees, entering the forest at the edge of Spence Field at some point between 4:30 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon on June 14th, 1969. He was, by all the accounts collected afterward, a child of ordinary June energy, moving with the same lightness that had carried the whole group across the meadow toward the tree line, part of a game that required nothing more complicated than crossing into the forest and coming out the other side. The prank was a child's prank, simple in its design, requiring no particular skill or courage, only the willingness to duck into the trees and emerge again from a direction that would produce a moment of surprise. The other boys had done it. They had entered and returned. The game had worked as designed, except for the part where it hadn't, except for the one boy who had stepped into the forest and not come back out of it. There is a particular quality to the moment when a search that began as an informal calling of names becomes something more organized. It is not always a single instant, but more often a gradual recognition. The calls continuing, the forest continuing to offer nothing back, the time passing in a way that begins to feel wrong, the light moving toward the quality that precedes evening, the adults present beginning to understand, in the way that adults understand such things before they fully acknowledge them, that this is not a matter of a child taking longer than expected. The Martin family reached that recognition in the late afternoon of June 14th, 1969. The campers at Spence Field reached it with them. The calls continued, and the forest continued to say nothing, and the afternoon moved on. Bill Martin had been at Spence Field with his family for a Father's Day weekend that had carried the ordinary texture of a familiar camping trip, the family's third or fourth visit to the park, the backcountry terrain already known to them, the weekend organized around the simple pleasures of being in a high mountain place with the people closest to them. The day's design had been comfortable. The meadow had been as it always was, wide and bright in the June light, the trail running through it, the forest at the edges. Nothing in the day's beginning had suggested anything other than what a Father's Day weekend in the Smokies was meant to be. His father called his name from the forest edge, and the forest received the name and returned nothing. Clyde Martin called the name alongside him. The other campers spread out along the perimeter. The calling continued, past the point where a delayed child would have answered, past the point where a child who was simply slow through the undergrowth would have emerged, into the territory where the absence of an answer becomes its own kind of fact. Quiet, insistent, unyielding, the forest at the edge of Spence Field absorbed the sound of the name being called and was unchanged by it. The terrain immediately beyond the tree line at Spence Field is not gradual. The bald's edge gives way to a descent in multiple directions, steep ground falling away toward creek drainages, the slopes broken by rocks and heavy with undergrowth, the kind of terrain that is easy enough to enter and considerably harder to navigate once the open ground of the meadow is no longer behind you. A child moving into that terrain without a specific direction in mind, without the guidance of a trail or the orientation provided by an adult, could find the ground changing beneath his feet almost immediately, the grass giving way to leaf litter and root systems, the light shifting from the full open light of the meadow to the broken partial light of a hardwood canopy in full June leaf, the sense of where the meadow was behind him becoming less certain with each step forward into the trees. The other boys had moved through the tree line with a plan that had a defined endpoint. Go through, come out the other side, appear at a point that would surprise the adults. They had carried that plan with them into the forest, and it had organized their movement within it. The endpoint had brought them out again. Dennis Martin had entered the same tree line at the same time in the same afternoon with the same general plan, and the plan had not brought him out. The June evening in the southern Appalachians comes gradually at elevation. The long light of summer holds across the high balds until late, the sky staying bright long after the lower ground has darkened, the open meadow of Spence Field holding the day's light in the way that open high places do. The search at the forest edge continued as the light began its slow change, the calls going into the trees, the searchers moving along the perimeter and within the immediate tree line, the forest offering no particular answer to any particular direction of inquiry. The shape of what had happened, a child had crossed into the forest and not returned, was becoming clearer with each hour that passed, even as the details of it remained completely opaque. The word that traveled down the mountain to reach the National Park Service rangers carried the essential fact of the situation. A 6-year-old child had entered the forest at the edge of Spence Field sometime between 4:30 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon and had not come out, had not answered calls, had not been located by the adults and campers who had been searching the immediate area since the moment his absence was noticed. The report was specific about what was known: the child, the location, the approximate time, the circumstances, and it was equally specific in the way of such reports about what was not known, which direction the child had gone, how far he had traveled, whether he had fallen or become confused or simply wandered in a direction no one had thought to look yet. The initial search at Spence Field had been conducted by people who were present and willing and who knew the meadow and its immediate surroundings. They were campers and hikers, not trained search and rescue personnel, but they had covered the ground available to them and had found nothing to indicate where Dennis had gone. The forest edge had been walked, The immediate slope below the bald had been entered and called through. The tree line had been examined for the kind of sign that a child's passage through undergrowth leaves, bent stems, displaced leaves, the impression in soft ground that a small boot makes. Whatever the terrain held or did not hold in those first hours, the search conducted by the people present at Spence Field produced no finding that could be followed. The afternoon settled into evening, and the evening took the quality that high-elevation evenings take in June, the air cooling, the meadow grass stilling as the breeze dropped, the light losing its afternoon fullness without yet becoming dark, the sky above the open bald holding its brightness, even as the forest on the bald's edges went darker. The martins were still at the forest edge. The calls were still going into the trees. The name was still being spoken outward into the forest that surrounded Spence Field, on all sides, the sound of it carrying into a landscape that stretched in every direction for dozens of miles, in every direction. Deep forest and steep drainages and ridge lines and creek bottoms, all of it continuous, and all of it capable of receiving a small person without being changed by it. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park encompassed its hundreds of thousands of acres in the same quiet it has always maintained. The park indifferent to the human movement within it. The forest indifferent to the names being called at its edge. The terrain simply the terrain, slope and drainage and canopy and undergrowth, and the particular close darkness of a forested mountainside when the meadow light above it no longer reaches down through the leaves. The park in June 1969 was the same park it had been the day before, and the same park it would be the day after. The forest at the edge of Spence Field received a child's passage into it and did not record it in any form that the people calling his name could read. Bill Martin, standing at the tree line, calling his youngest son's name into the forest, had arrived at Spence Field for a Father's Day weekend. The weekend had been chosen with the ease of familiarity, the park known to the family, the meadow a place they had been before, the whole arrangement of the trip carrying the comfort of a repeated pleasure. By the late afternoon of the first full day, the comfort had given way to something else, not yet the full shape of what it would become, not yet named in the way it would later be named, but already changed from what the morning had been. The name was being called into the trees. The trees were not answering. The search at the immediate forest edge extended as far as the available personnel and the available light could reach. The campers present moved outward from the point of last sighting along the tree line and into the forest itself, calling, looking, listening for any sound that would give a direction. The June evening continued its slow progress. The light changed, and the calls continued, and the forest continued to offer nothing back. The report reached the rangers below. The formal response was beginning to take shape, and at the edge of Spence Field, the meadow was still there, wide and open, and lit by the long summer evening light, the grass moving in the high elevation air, the tree line standing at its distance from the meadow's center, in the same place it had always stood. Dennis Lloyd Martin was 6 years old. He had crossed a meadow with a group of boys in the afternoon of a Father's Day, moving toward the forest at its edge as part of a game that all the boys had played, a simple game with a simple shape, a game that ended with a surprise and a return to the open meadow where the adults waited. The other boys had come back out. They had emerged from the trees and completed the prank as the plan had specified, appearing from an unexpected direction, the surprise achieved, the game done, and Dennis had not come back out. He had stepped into the forest at the edge of Spence Field between 4:30 and 5 o'clock on the afternoon of June 14th, 1969, and the forest had simply received him, as forests receive everything that enters them, without particular notice, without particular record, without returning what had gone in. The calls from the meadow edge went into the trees and did not come back. The family stood at the boundary where the open bald ended, and the forest began, calling a name outward into a wilderness that stretched for more than 500,000 acres in every direction. And the wilderness received the name as it receives all sound, absorbing it, dispersing it, letting it travel as far as it could travel before the distance, and the density of the forest brought it to nothing. The other campers at Spence Field moved in different directions, from the meadow's center, voices carrying outward from the bald into the surrounding trees, the sound of them audible to each other across the open grass, and then at the tree line, becoming muffled by the canopy and the undergrowth. The search spread from the point where Dennis had last been seen, the specific place at the forest edge where the adult's last view of him placed him, stepping into the trees, and extended outward from there in the directions the available searchers could cover. The terrain in those directions descended in most cases fairly quickly from the elevation of the bald, the slope falling away toward creek drainages and ridge cuts, the ground becoming more difficult as the distance from the meadow increased. Nothing came back from the forest, no voice, no rustle of undergrowth that resolved into a small figure pushing through toward the light, no sound from any direction that could be identified as a child responding to the calls being sent into the trees. The search at the edge of Spence Field in those first hours found the forest to be exactly what it was, a wilderness of considerable size and considerable density, indifferent to the urgency of the people moving through its edges, offering no path that led anywhere, giving nothing back. The report that traveled down the mountain to the National Park Service that evening carried the fact of the disappearance in its simplest form. A child, 6 years old, had entered the forest at Spence Field in the mid-afternoon and had not been located. The family was on scene. Other campers were assisting. The immediate search had produced no result. The rangers would be needed. The formal operation would need to begin. The meadow at Spence Field was still lit by the long June evening light when the formal response was first taking shape below. The grass was still moving in the high elevation breeze. The tree line was still where it had always been, at the distance from the meadow's center that it had always occupied, the same forest edge that the boys had walked toward in the afternoon with their simple plan, the same boundary where the open bald ended and the dense southern Appalachian forest began. The Martin family stood at that boundary as the evening deepened around them, calling a name into the forest, the calls going in and not returning, the trees standing as they had always stood. The meadow opened behind them, the forest closed ahead, the two worlds meeting exactly at the line where the grass ended and the first trees began. Within a very short period of time, the minutes between the moment the other boys emerged from the woods and the moment it became clear that Dennis would not, a 6-year-old boy, had passed from view so completely that the people present could not determine which direction he had gone. The meadow had been open, the afternoon had been clear, the game had been simple, and the other boys had completed it, and Dennis had crossed into the forest, as they all had, and the forest had simply not given him back. The calls into the trees drew no answer. The tree line stood unchanged. The evening light moved slowly across the open bald at Spence Field, and the forest at its edges remained exactly as it had been before, quiet and dense, and without any indication in any direction from the boundary where Dennis Martin had last been seen of where he had gone. The ridge at Spence Field sits at approximately 4,900 feet above sea level, and from that elevation on a clear June afternoon, the surrounding landscape opens in every direction layer after layer of forested ridgeline, receding into a blue-gray haze that gives the southern Appalachians their name. The open bald of the meadow itself covers several acres. The grass moves there in a way that grass at lower elevations does not, catching a high wind that passes over the ridge without obstacle, bending in long, slow sweeps from one end of the clearing to the other. At the edges of that clearing, the forest begins. Not gradually, not with a scattering of saplings or a thinning of the canopy. The trees begin where the meadow ends, and on the other side of that line, the light changes completely. Great Smoky Mountains National Park contained by 1969 approximately 521,490 acres of protected land. That figure is worth holding for a moment before moving through it. 521,000 acres is not an abstraction, it is a physical territory of dense, layered, high-relief terrain straddling the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, a place where ridges run for miles without a road crossing them, and where the valleys between those ridges hold streams that drain into creek systems, that drain into rivers, that the park itself never fully reaches. More than 800 miles of maintained trail ran through that territory in 1969. 800 miles of trail means thousands of miles of slope and drainage and forest that no maintained trail ever crossed. The documented, surveyed, mapped portion of the park, the trails, the campgrounds, the fire roads, was the smaller portion. The rest was simply terrain. Spence Field occupies a position on the Tennessee-North Carolina state line, part of a long ridge that the Appalachian Trail follows as it passes through the park. The ridge at this point is the spine of the mountain range at its most exposed, wide enough at the top to hold the open bald, narrow enough that within a few hundred feet of the meadow's edge, the land begins to fall away on both sides. To the south, the slopes descend toward Eagle Creek and its drainage system, a series of steep hollows and creek bottoms that drop several thousand feet in elevation over a relatively short horizontal distance. To the north, the terrain descends toward the Cadiz Cove area, a gentler slope by comparison, but still substantial, covered in the same dense forest that characterizes every descent from the high ridges of the Smokies. The ridge itself is long, and the bald is a particular feature of it, open where the surrounding terrain is not, exposed where the slopes below are enclosed. It is the kind of place that draws people specifically because of the contrast, the sudden wideness after a long walk through closed trees, the forest that borders Spence Field on all sides, and that covers the slopes descending from the ridge in every direction, is not a simple thing to describe with accuracy. The southern Appalachian forest at elevations between 4,000 and 5,500 feet includes multiple distinct plant communities growing in close proximity, and often in tandem. The hardwoods at this elevation, beech, yellow birch, sugar maple, black cherry, reach their full canopy height in June, when the leaves are at their densest, and the light that reaches the forest floor is already fragmentary, broken into pieces by a canopy that has closed completely overhead. Beneath the hardwood canopy, in many areas of the park, and particularly in the drainage hollows and along the creek bottoms, rhododendron grows in formations that have no equivalent in most other forested environments in the eastern United States. Rhododendron thickets in the Smokies grow not as isolated shrubs, but as interlocked woody communities whose individual stems can reach the diameter of a person's forearm and whose branching structure, at chest height, forms a lattice so dense that passage through it requires physical effort. The branches do not yield easily to pressure, they redirect. A person moving through a mature rhododendron thicket does not walk forward in a straight line. Movement is lateral and low and slow, requiring a constant adjustment of the body relative to the next branch, the next gap, the next downward angle. The space beneath the thicket, where the ground is often the only place where forward movement is possible, which means that passage through dense rhododendron is sometimes a matter of crouching or crawling along a floor of accumulated leaf litter and bare root systems, with the branches pressing down from above and the light effectively absent. In those conditions, visibility in any direction is measured in feet rather than yards. Mountain laurel grows in similar patterns in the Smokies, and at the elevation surrounding Spence Field, both species are present, often intermixed, occupying the slopes between the hardwood canopy above and the stream channels below. The effect in the drainages leading away from the ridge is a forest interior that is layered in a way that resists easy movement and reduces sightlines to a minimum. A person standing still in such terrain on a clear afternoon would hear the wind moving through the canopy far above and might see, in fragments through the overhead branches, the blue of the sky. Everything at eye level and below would be close, vegetated, and still. The boulders and rock outcroppings that appear throughout the Smokies forest add another dimension to the terrain's complexity. Moss-covered and often wet, they rise from the forest floor without warning, particularly in the creek drainages, where the stream has cut through the underlying rock over centuries and left exposed faces and tumbled debris. Some of these boulder fields are navigable by a careful adult moving slowly. Others require a specific route through them that a person unfamiliar with the immediate terrain would not easily find. Between the boulders, the gaps are irregular and sometimes deep, covered in fern, filled with accumulated debris, offering little indication from above of what lies at the bottom of a step that looks straight forward. The creeks that run through these drainages are cold even in June. The water comes off the high ridges where precipitation is heavy and the canopy keeps the ground from warming, and it moves fast over the rock bed, particularly after rain. Eagle Creek and its tributary drainages collect water from a large area of high elevation terrain and carry it south and west down through the park in a series of cascades and pools whose banks are often undercut and whose edges are covered in the kind of wet, slick moss that offers no reliable footing. The water itself is clear and cold and fast. The sound of it moving over rock carries a considerable distance through the forest, which means that in a drainage hollow, the ambient sound of the creek can mask other sounds, including voices calling from a short distance away. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1969 supported a well-established population of American black bears. Estimates placed that population at several hundred individuals distributed across the park's full extent, with concentrations in areas where food sources were reliable and human disturbance was low. The high elevation areas of the park, including the ridge terrain around Spence Field, were part of the established range of these animals in 1969, as they remain today. The park's bear population was not the only large mammal present in the Smokies backcountry at that time. Wild boar, feral pigs descended from European stock, introduced for hunting purposes in North Carolina earlier in the 20th century, had been established in the park for decades by 1969 and occupied a range that included the terrain at and below the high ridges. Both species were present in the Spence Field area, and both were part of the ecological reality of the park that any search operation in that terrain would have to account for as background fact. What all of these details, the rhododendron thickets, the boulder fields, the steep creek drainages, the wildlife populations describe, taken together, is not a hostile environment. They describe a specific one. The Smokies backcountry is not a landscape that works against human movement, so much as it is a landscape that demands specificity from human movement, a particular route, a particular pace, a particular awareness of what lies a few feet ahead. For someone who knows the terrain or who has moved through it many times, these features are navigable. They are simply what the forest is. For someone who does not know the terrain or who is moving through it without a clear direction, they become a series of decisions that compound in difficulty the further one travels from a known starting point. The southern Appalachian forest at high elevation receives substantial annual precipitation. Documented figures for areas like Spence Field place annual rainfall at more than 85 inches, roughly twice the average annual rainfall for much of the eastern United States. That precipitation is not evenly distributed across the year. The summer months bring a pattern of afternoon and evening thunderstorms that can develop quickly at high elevation, dropping significant rain in a short period before moving on. The storms that moved through the Spence Field area on the evening of June 14, 1969, and in the days that followed, were consistent with that pattern. Rain fell on the high ridges and on the slopes below them in the hours after Dennis Martin was last seen, and it continued intermittently in the days that followed. Rain at high elevation in the Smokies does several things to the terrain that are directly relevant to what a search operation in that terrain can and cannot accomplish. It compresses and flattens the surface layer of the soil and leaf litter, removing the loose, dry texture in which a boot print or a small footprint might hold its shape for hours or days. It moves small debris, fragments of bark, displaced moss, bent grass stems, back toward a neutral position, eliminating some of the subtle signs that an experienced tracker reads as indicators of recent passage. It fills the drainage channels and raises the creek levels, making some crossings more difficult and obscuring the banks and creek beds where a person might have passed. It degrades scent. The essential oils and biological materials that leave a scent trail detectable by a trained search dog are water-soluble to a meaningful degree, and heavy rain moving through a scent trail can dilute it, disperse it, or wash it away entirely within hours of falling. The scent conditions in the terrain below Spence Field after the rain of June 14th and the subsequent storms would have been, for any search dog working that ground, among the more difficult possible conditions. Not impossible. Trained bloodhounds and other scent-tracking dogs are capable of following trails that have been compromised by rain, particularly when the scent source is recent and the dog begins its work before too much time has elapsed. But rain introduces a complexity that cannot be fully compensated for, and the combination of rain falling on steep terrain, where surface water runs down slope and carries scent material with it, adds a further layer of difficulty that experienced handlers acknowledge as a genuine constraint on what a dog can reliably establish. The topographic complexity of the Spence Field area deserves a specific description because it is easy to hear the name of a mountain park and form an impression of terrain that is simpler than what actually exists there. The area within a 1-mile radius of Spence Field is not uniform. The ridgeline itself is the highest point in the immediate area, and the terrain falls away from it, not in a single smooth slope, but in a series of irregular descents divided by subsidiary ridges, hollow systems, and the drainage channels that cut between them. A person descending from Spence Field in any direction other than along the maintained trail would encounter this irregular terrain immediately, a slope that begins at a walkable angle and steepens, a hollow that appears to offer a clear route, and then closes into a narrow drainage, choked with rhododendron, a subsidiary ridge that seems to lead somewhere and then ends at a drop that requires backtracking. The effect of this topographic irregularity for a search operation trying to account systematically for where a missing person might have traveled is that the area to be covered is substantially larger than a flat terrain search of the same radius. Movement through irregular terrain is not linear. It is subject to obstacle and redirection. A person who entered the tree line at the edge of Spence Field, moving in a particular compass direction, would not necessarily continue in that direction for more than a few hundred feet before the terrain itself altered the course of movement. A steep drop requiring a turn, a thicket requiring a detour, a drainage requiring a crossing, or a descent. The actual area reachable from Spence Field in an hour of movement was not the area within 1 mile in a straight line. It was the area reachable by the routes that the terrain permitted, which in some directions was less than 1 mile, and in others was considerably more, depending on the gradient and the undergrowth. A search grid in such terrain, a systematic effort to have trained personnel cover every portion of a defined area within a set distance of a starting point, is geometrically complex in ways that flat terrain searches are not. The spacing between searchers that allows them to remain within sight or sound of one another on open ground needs to be compressed considerably in dense forest because the visibility between adjacent positions may be only a few feet. Compressing that spacing means that the same area requires more personnel to cover it systematically than an equivalent area in open country. More personnel means more coordination, more noise, more disruption of the very signs of passage that the search is trying to identify. The practical reality of searching dense forested terrain at high elevation is that even a large, well-organized operation is working with constraints that the terrain itself imposes and that no amount of additional resources can entirely overcome. In the days immediately following June 14th, the weather in the Spencefield area continued to include periods of rain. The storms that moved through the high terrain were not continuous. They came in episodes, as summer storms in the southern Appalachians tend to do, separated by periods of clearing that allowed searchers to work, but during which the damage to scent trails and surface signs done by the previous rain had already accumulated. Each subsequent storm added to that damage. By the time a search operation had been running for several days in the terrain below Spence Field, the conditions on the ground reflected not the state of the forest on the afternoon of June 14th, but the state of the forest after multiple rain events, multiple nights of cooling, and the disturbance of hundreds of searchers moving through the undergrowth. The high elevation forest of the Smokies has a particular quality in the period after a heavy summer rain. The canopy closes over itself more completely when wet, and the light that filters through it becomes softer and more diffuse, without the broken bright patches that appear on dry afternoons. The moss on the boulders and root systems takes on a deeper color, a saturated, dense green that makes the forest floor appear uniformly soft and undifferentiated, hiding the hard edges of rock and root beneath a surface that looks continuous. The rhododendron thickets darken, the air cools and holds the smell of wet soil and leaf litter and the particular faint mineral quality of water running over stone somewhere close below. Sound travels differently. The ambient noise of the forest after rain, water dripping from the canopy, the creek running higher than before, the occasional call of a bird resuming its routine, is a different acoustic environment than the dry forest. And the voices of searchers calling across the slope carry and are absorbed differently depending on the specific topography they are working through. The meadow at Spence Field after rain becomes a different surface than the dry afternoon meadow. The grass flattens under the weight of the water and stays flat for some time after the storm passes. The ground beneath the grass, which on dry days is firm enough to bear a person's weight without leaving a significant impression, becomes softer and holds footprints more readily. The tree line at the meadow's edge, seen from the open bald, is darkened and dense looking after rain, the leaves holding moisture on their upper surfaces, the interior of the forest behind them indistinct. The trail that crosses Spence Field and continues along the ridge becomes visible as a slight depression in the wet grass, a line of slightly flattened growth that the rain has made more legible rather than less. Around the periphery of the meadow, at the points where the grass ends and the forest begins, the ground is wet and soft in the way that forest margins are after heavy rain, the soil loosened, the moss saturated, the roots slick. The scale of the park as a whole, that figure of 521,000 acres, becomes most meaningful when considered in relation to the specific starting point of any search conducted within it. From Spence Field, the park extends in every direction for distances that dwarf the radius any single search operation can systematically cover in the time available. To the south, the terrain descends into drainages that reach the southern boundary of the park many miles away. To the west, the ridge trail leads through country that remains remote and lightly visited, even by the standards of the backcountry. To the north, the descent toward Katie's Cove passes through terrain that is less steep than the southern drainages, but no less dense in its vegetation. In every direction, the park is large in a way that is difficult to hold in mind as an operational reality. Large in the sense that its interior contains distances and areas that a search operation working from a single point can address only partially, no matter how many personnel are involved and no matter how well organized the effort. The 800 miles of maintained trail that ran through the park in 1969 represent the routes that the Park Service had established and maintained as travel corridors. They are not the only routes through the terrain. People, animals, and water all move through the park on paths that no trail map records. The creek drainages are their own corridors, used by wildlife and by water, following the path of least resistance down the slope. The ridge system creates natural routes along the high terrain. Between the maintained trails and the natural corridors, the park contains a network of potential movement that is not fully mapped and not fully knowable from a position at any single point within it. The forest does not hold a record of who has passed through it in a form that is easily read. Leaves grow back, bent stems straighten, footprints fill with water, and then dry and then fill with new leaf fall. The signs that an experienced tracker reads as evidence of passage are time-sensitive in ways that depend on the specific conditions: temperature, humidity, rainfall, canopy density of the days since the passage occurred. In the Smokies in June, with the canopy at its fullest and the rainfall frequent and heavy, the window during which those signs remain legible is shorter than in drier, more open terrain. The forest processes what passes through it with a speed that varies by season, and summer in the southern Appalachians is the season when that processing is most active, when growth is fastest, and the conditions are most favorable to the decomposition and absorption of whatever the terrain receives. The high ridges of the Smokies have been covered in forest for a very long time. The trees at the edge of Spence Field's meadow are old, and the root systems beneath them extend deep into the rock and soil of the ridge. The bald itself, the open grassy clearing at the top, is a feature whose origins are still discussed in ecological literature, a clearing that has persisted for reasons that are not entirely clear, maintained over time by a combination of grazing history, soil conditions, and elevation that keeps it open even as the surrounding forest continues to exert the pressure that on any other slope at this elevation would close the clearing into trees within decades. The bald is, in some sense, a temporary feature in geological time, but in human terms, it has been open for as long as anyone has been walking through this country and recording what they found. The park itself was established in the 1930s, but the mountains it protects are far older than any of the human uses that have been made of them. The forest that covers those mountains now is old growth in many of its upper reaches, never logged, its structure the product of centuries of growth and storm and fire and the slow processes of soil formation and species succession that a protected forest undergoes when left to itself. In 1969, the park had been protected for roughly 30 years, enough time for the most accessible areas to have a well-managed appearance, enough time for the backcountry to have returned to something approaching its pre-settlement condition in the areas where it had been disturbed, and more than enough time in the areas that had never been disturbed at all for the forest to be exactly what it had always been, dense, layered, and indifferent to the activities of any particular search operation conducted within it. The trails that searchers would use to access the terrain below Spence Field in the days after June 14th were maintained paths, but they did not lead everywhere that a search needed to go. The grid that a systematic search requires, the careful, side-by-side coverage of terrain in strips wide enough to be comprehensive, demanded that searchers leave the trail and enter the off-trail forest, where the rhododendron and the steep slopes and the boulder fields and the creek crossings were not a backdrop to travel, but the travel itself. Every step off the maintained path placed a searcher into terrain that required the full attention of someone moving through it, carefully. That attention necessarily directed toward the mechanics of movement, the next foothold, the next branch to push aside, the next gap through the undergrowth, is attention that cannot simultaneously be directed toward the careful observation of signs of passage that tracking requires. Moving through the Smokies backcountry is its own demand. Searching it while moving through it is a compounding of two difficult things. The precipitation that continued to fall on the Spence Field area in the days after the disappearance did not fall uniformly. Storms in the southern Appalachians tend to follow the ridge systems, and the rainfall at Spence Field itself on the exposed bald and its immediately surrounding forest may have differed in timing and intensity from the rainfall in the deeper drainages to the south and north. The creek bottoms and hollow systems that lie below the ridge receive their moisture both directly from rainfall and indirectly from runoff that travels down the steep slopes and collects in the lowest points of the terrain. In heavy rain, these hollow systems fill quickly. The soil becomes saturated, and the surface water moves rapidly downslope, carrying whatever is loose with it, leaf fragments, small debris, and any light material that sits on the ground surface. The image of the Spence Field tree line in the hours after a summer storm is a specific one. The meadow grass is flat and wet. The trail crossing the bald holds standing water in its lowest points. The forest beyond the tree line is dark, its interior indistinct behind a wall of wet foliage, the canopy dripping long after the rain itself has stopped. The boundary between the open clearing and the enclosed forest is sharply defined even after rain. The meadow is open and gray under the overcast sky. The forest behind it is darker, closer, sealed by its own density against easy view from the outside. At the precise point where the grass ends and the first trees begin, the ground transitions from the compressed, flattened grass of the bald to the wet, soft soil of the forest floor, where the root systems of the nearest trees extend outward and the first layer of accumulated leaf litter begins. The rainfall that moved through the Spencefield area in the hours and days following June 14, 1969, moved through that tree line as it moved through all the terrain around it, falling through the canopy in heavy drops from the saturated leaves above, running along the root systems and into the soil, collecting in the low points of the terrain and moving down slope. It fell on the meadow grass and on the forest floor without distinction, on the maintained trail and on the off-trail terrain with equal impartiality. It moved across the ground and through it, and as it moved, it carried with it whatever the ground held that was not fixed, and left behind what the ground had always held, and what it would continue to hold long after the rain passed through, and the sky cleared, and the sun returned to the high bald, and the wet grass slowly dried and stood again in the high elevation wind that crossed the ridge without pause, as it always had, as it would continue to do across every subsequent June that followed this one. On the night of June 14th, 1969, National Park Service rangers received word that a 6-year-old boy had not come out of the tree line at Spence Field. The report reached the park's communication channels within hours of the disappearance, and by the time darkness had settled fully over the high ridges, rangers were already beginning to move toward the backcountry. The first organized response was mounted that same evening, with personnel entering the terrain around Spence Field before the night was over, working by whatever light they carried into a forest that offered very little of its own. By the morning of June 15th, a formal grid search had been established. The starting point was the edge of Spence Field itself, the boundary where the open grassy bald ended and the dense southern Appalachian forest began, the exact line of trees through which Dennis Martin had stepped the afternoon before. Rangers marked the perimeter, assigned sectors, and began directing personnel outward from that point in organized lines, each team responsible for a designated portion of the slope below the ridge. The terrain immediately surrounding Spence Field descends in multiple directions toward Eagle Creek to the south, toward the Cades Cove drainage to the north, and along the ridge itself in both directions toward adjacent high elevation terrain. The search had to account for all of those directions at once, and in the first days it expanded outward as quickly as the available personnel and the difficulty of the landscape allowed. The number of people involved grew steadily through the first week. Trained search and rescue teams arrived from within the park system and from cooperating agencies. Tennessee state law enforcement officers contributed personnel. Civilian volunteers came in numbers that made the operation, at its height, one of the largest wilderness searches the National Park System had documented in that period. Estimates of the total personnel involved varied across accounts, but figures ranging from several hundred to more than 1,000 individuals appear in the record of those days, a count that reflects both the scale of the family's appeal for assistance and the degree to which the search drew regional and eventually national attention. The forest around Spence Field, which in ordinary circumstances saw perhaps a few dozen hikers on a given June weekend, became for a period of days and then weeks a landscape crossed in every direction by people moving methodically through it, calling a name. Among the resources deployed in the earliest phase of the search were bloodhound tracking dogs brought in to work the scent trail from the point where Dennis had last been seen. A bloodhound, when conditions are favorable, can follow a scent trail through difficult terrain with a reliability that other search methods cannot match. What the dogs required in the hours and days after June 14th was a stable trail, scent deposited on vegetation and ground cover, preserved by weather, not yet degraded by time, or washed away by rain. The dogs were worked from the tree line at the edge of Spence Field, the last confirmed location. What the record shows is that the dogs worked the area. What the record also shows is that the heavy rain, which began falling on the evening of June 14th and continued through the days that followed, compromised whatever scent trail may have existed. By the time the full tracking resources were deployed, the ground around Spence Field and the slopes below it had been washed by rainfall significant enough to reduce the probability of a successful track. The dogs worked. The results were not what the search needed them to be. The rain that arrived on the evening of Dennis's disappearance was not a brief summer shower. The high elevation zones of the Smoky Mountains receive exceptional annual precipitation, more than 85 inches in areas along the Tennessee-North Carolina border, distributed across the seasons in a pattern that includes heavy summer thunderstorms moving through the ridges with speed and force. What came to Spence Field in the hours after June 14th, 1969, was consistent with that pattern. The storms that moved through the search zone in the first days altered the terrain in ways that affected every method being used. Footprints softened and dissolved in wet earth. Bent vegetation recovered under rainfall and could no longer hold the shape of recent passage. The surfaces that trackers read, the disturbed leaves, the pressed moss, the faint impressions in soft ground, were washed and reset by water moving across slopes that could not contain it. The forest below Spence Field, in the days that followed the disappearance, was a different surface than the one a child had moved across on a clear afternoon. Among the civilian personnel who worked alongside the official search teams in those first days was a man named Tom Burnett, an experienced woodsman with particular familiarity with the terrain of the Smoky Mountains. Burnett worked as a tracker, a traditional role that required reading the ground for signs of passage, signs that trained dogs and organized grid teams sometimes missed or passed over in the course of covering large areas quickly. What a skilled tracker brought to a search like this one was time and attention, the willingness to move slowly through a small area and read every detail of the surface at close range, rather than covering distance and calling out as a grid team must. Burnett crouched in the forest below Spence Field and read the ground the way a person reads a document they understand, looking not for what is obvious, but for what is slightly out of order, slightly inconsistent with the surrounding material, a bent stem at an angle that rain alone would not produce, a stone displaced from the depression it had rested in, the faint edge of an impression in soil that had partially dried at the surface while remaining soft below. Burnett worked the terrain in the days following the disappearance with the kind of focused attention his methods required, moving through areas that the larger search had already crossed, looking for what the larger search had not been designed to find. What the record shows is that Tom Burnett's work, like the work of the tracking dogs, did not produce a confirmed trail. No definitive track was established. No sign that could be confirmed as Dennis Martin's passage through a specific point in the forest was identified and followed to a further point, and then to a further one. The forest gave back details. There were always details in terrain like this, always something slightly different from the baseline, but nothing that held together as a continuous and confirmed line from the meadow to any point beyond it. The tracking work produced no outcome that the investigation could use to direct the search toward a specific location or a specific direction of travel. This was documented, as everything in the search was documented, without a resolution attached to it. The Green Berets arrived within the first days. U.S. Kunguro, Kugkaisestri Scorpion Diripsri Brun. Army Special Forces soldiers from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, were deployed to the Smoky Mountains to assist with the search. Personnel selected: The deployment noted for their wilderness survival expertise and their experience moving through extremely difficult terrain. Special Forces training at that period included extended wilderness operations, survival in hostile or remote environments, and the ability to function in terrain that would slow or stop less specifically trained searchers. The drainages below Spence Field, particularly the steep creek bottoms descending toward Eagle Creek to the south, were the kind of terrain the Green Berets were sent into. Places where the slope was severe enough to require the use of hands and feet, where the creek moved fast and cold over mossy boulders in the shade of a canopy that admitted very little light, even at midday, where the undergrowth pressed close enough to the narrow passage of the drainage to require constant physical contact to move through it all. What those drainages held, for a searcher working through them in June 1969, was the specific combination of difficulty and density that defined the lower elevation forest throughout the search zone. The rhododendron thickets that filled the drainages and the steep slopes between them were not spaces one moved through with ease. The branches interlocked above at a height that required crouching or crawling, and the interior of a mature rhododendron stand was a close shadowed space where visibility in any direction was measured in feet rather than yards. Beneath the rhododendron, the ground was soft with accumulated organic matter, and along the creek beds, the boulders were covered in a green growth that held moisture long after rain had passed. The Green Berets moved through this terrain systematically, covering the creek bottoms and the slopes between them, descending in some sectors well below the elevation of Spence Field in the direction the drainage routes would naturally have taken a person or carried them from the ridge. They found nothing. The documentation of the Special Forces deployment, like the documentation of every other component of the search, records the terrain covered and the methods used. It does not record a finding that led anywhere. The creek bottoms were searched. The rhododendron thickets were pressed through, section by section, personnel emerging at the far edge of one and entering the next. The steep slopes between drainages were descended in lines. The boulders along the creek beds were examined. At the end of those days, the search zone in the southern drainages held the same absence it had held at the beginning of them. No physical trace, no confirmed sign, no point in the terrain that the record identified as a location where Dennis Martin had been. The organized grid search, meanwhile, was expanding outward from the ridge at Spence Field in all accessible directions. A grid search works on a principle of coverage, given enough personnel, spaced at intervals narrow enough that nothing significant can pass between them. A grid search should find what is in the terrain it covers. The spacing of searchers in the grid around Spence Field had to be calibrated to the density of the forest, and the density of that forest meant that even searchers close enough to call to each other could not see each other through the undergrowth. A grid line that moved through a mature rhododendron thicket might pass within 2 or 3 feet of something lying on the ground and not see it, not because the searchers were inattentive, but because the vegetation between them was opaque at that range. The forest in the Smokies at mid-elevation is not a forest of open ground and well-spaced trunks. It is a forest of layered density, canopy, understory, shrub layer, ground cover, each layer capable of concealing what lies within it from observers at the next layer up or the next layer over. The search covered an area that expanded significantly as the days passed, and the initial close-in search of the Spence Field surroundings produced nothing. When a child is not found in the terrain immediately adjacent to the last known location, the working assumption is that the search radius must increase. The child moved farther than expected, or was moved, or entered terrain that carried them naturally beyond the nearest zone. The organized search around Spence Field extended outward in subsequent days into terrain that represented hours of difficult travel, from the meadow, covering drainages and ridge lines and trail corridors that a 6-year-old could not have reached under his own power in the time available. The expansion of the search zone reflected the absence of any finding that would have allowed it to be narrowed without a confirmed track, without a scent trail, without any physical sign establishing a direction of travel. The search had to cover everything. Civilian volunteers came in numbers that made the operation difficult to manage, as well as difficult to conduct. The coordination of several hundred to 1,000 or more people across rugged backcountry terrain with limited communication infrastructure in a wilderness area in 1969 placed significant demands on the National Park Service personnel directing the search. Volunteers had to be briefed, assigned to sectors, escorted into backcountry zones they were not familiar with, and monitored to prevent the search from generating its own secondary problems: lost volunteers, injuries in the steep terrain, searchers inadvertently contaminating ground that trackers had not yet examined. The management of that many people in that landscape over that many days was itself a substantial undertaking, and the official personnel conducting it were simultaneously trying to maintain the search's methodological integrity under conditions that the rain and the terrain were continuously working against. In the days that followed the initial intensive search, the weeks that followed the initial intensive search saw the scale of the operation gradually reduce as the ground covered without result grew larger and the remaining unsearched terrain became increasingly remote and inaccessible. The search did not stop abruptly. It contracted. The volunteer numbers decreased. The organized grid teams covered their assigned sectors and were not always replaced with new ones. The area of active daily searching shrank back toward the zones that still seemed most likely given the available information. But no specific information directed the search toward any particular location during that contraction. There was no report, no finding, no development in the case that would have justified concentrating resources in a new area rather than recovering the terrain already searched. The search contracted without a reason to do otherwise, which meant it contracted without finding what it was looking for. Tom Burnett returned to the terrain more than once. His approach, slow, particular, focused on the specific small-scale signs that larger organized searches could not pause to examine, was suited to a different phase of the operation than the initial intensive days, when coverage rather than depth was the primary requirement. In the quieter period after the main search had reduced in scale, Burnett worked sectors of the forest below Spence Field with the kind of attention that only one or two people moving slowly through a limited area can bring to the ground. He was looking for something the rain might not have completely erased: a fragment of clothing caught on a branch above the rain line, a displacement of stones along a drainage that spoke of passage rather than water, anything in the material of the forest that did not belong to the forest. What he found, or more precisely, what the record shows he did not find in any confirmed form, was the same absence that had met every other method. The forest held its information, if it held any, in a form that the search could not retrieve. There is a particular quality to a search that produces nothing across an extended period of time. It is not simply the absence of a finding, it is the accumulation of that absence, day after day, sector after sector, method after method. Each day of searching without a result does not simply leave the situation unchanged. It produces its own information, of a kind. It establishes that the child is not in the terrain that has been covered, or more precisely, that the search methods used in that terrain did not detect the child's presence. These are slightly different things. A grid search that passes through a sector and finds nothing confirms that the child was not visible at the surface of that sector at the time the grid passed through it. It does not confirm that the child was never there, or that the child is not there now, or that the child could not be found by other methods. The negative result of a search is a genuine finding, but it is a finding that requires careful interpretation, and in the case of Dennis Martin, the interpretation of the search's negative findings was one of the things that remained genuinely open. The tracking dogs that were brought in represented the most sensitive detection technology available for wilderness searches in 1969. A bloodhound working a confirmed scent trail under favorable conditions could follow a person's passage across terrain for distances that no other detection method could match, and could work through undergrowth and across difficult ground that would stop or redirect a human searcher. The conditions at Spence Field in the hours and days after June 14th, 1969, were not favorable in the specific technical sense that matters to this kind of work. The rain that began that evening was the most significant single factor working against the scent trail that searchers needed. Scent degrades in rainfall, washes from vegetation, disperses across saturated ground in ways that no longer preserve the directional information a tracker and a dog need in order to follow it. What the dogs encountered at the tree line and in the immediate forest beyond it was terrain that the rain had already worked on. Not impossible, but compromised in a way that the search record reflects in its outcome. Multiple teams of dogs were worked across different sectors of the search zone as the days passed. The record notes the dogs' deployment and the areas they covered. The record also notes that no confirmed scent trail was established that led to a finding. The dogs worked the ground, and the ground, wet and reset by the storms moving through the high elevations in those first days, did not yield the thread the search needed. This was not a failure of the dogs or the handlers who worked them. It was a consequence of the specific combination of terrain, weather, and time that the search encountered from its first hours, conditions that would have challenged the same methods in any wilderness environment, and that in the specific terrain surrounding Spence Field proved impossible to overcome. The weeks-long search for Dennis Martin represents by any measure an extraordinary deployment of human effort and resources into a wilderness environment. The National Park Service brought to bear everything available to it in 1969: trained personnel, search dogs, professional trackers, military expertise, and the organized effort of hundreds of civilian volunteers across terrain that it knew well and had managed for decades. The effort was sustained across days and then weeks, expanding and then contracting as the situation developed, without producing a result that would redirect it. The cooperation between the Park Service, the Army, the state law enforcement agencies, and the civilian community that responded to the disappearance of a 6-year-old boy on a Father's Day weekend was genuine, organized, and large in its scale. It produced nothing that the record could attach to a location, a direction, or an explanation. What the search record contains, in its completed form, is a detailed account of what was done and where it was done and who did it. Sector by sector, the terrain around Spence Field was covered. Drainage by drainage, the creek bottoms below the ridge were examined. Trail corridor by trail corridor, the approaches to and from the high elevation bald were walked and searched by personnel who knew what they were looking for and were paying careful attention. The record that documents all of this is substantial. The logs of assigned sectors, the reports of individual search teams, the documentation of the dogs' work, and the tracking efforts, and the military deployment. It is a record of remarkable effort. What it is not, and what it has never become, is a record that arrives at a conclusion. The forest surrounding Spence Field received all of that effort. The hundreds of people who moved through it, the dogs that worked its ground, the trackers who read its surface, the soldiers who descended its steepest drainages, and gave none of it a result. This is the plain documented fact of the search. It is not that the terrain was inadequately searched, though the terrain was genuinely difficult and the weather genuinely damaging to the methods available. It is not that the effort was insufficient, though no effort of any scale could guarantee a finding in a forest of that density and scale. It is simply that the search, conducted over days and weeks by the largest organized operation the park system had seen in that period, ended without a confirmed physical finding of any kind. No footprint confirmed as Dennis Martin's beyond the immediate vicinity of Spence Field. No article of clothing, no personal belonging, no biological material, nothing in the terrain that the search had covered that could be attached to the 6-year-old boy who had walked into the tree line on a June afternoon and not walked back out of it. The search teams that had come from across the region, the rangers, the volunteers, the soldiers, the trackers eventually dispersed. The organized operation wound down across the weeks following the disappearance, the active daily searching giving way to periodic returns to sectors that had already been covered without result. The scale of what had been attempted was not lost on those who had participated in it, and the absence of a finding despite that scale was itself a fact that the people who had searched the forest carried with them when they left it. The forest at Spence Field, once the search had passed through it, looked as it always had, the slopes descending from the open bald in every direction, the rhododendron closing over the creek beds, the canopy in full June leaf, admitting the light in pieces. The meadow above, when the searchers had gone from it, returned to the quiet it held between the weekends when hikers came up the trail and crossed it. Tom Burnett, who had spent more time reading the specific surface of that forest than perhaps anyone else in the weeks following June 14th, eventually left the terrain as the others had. The tracking work had been done as thoroughly as it could be done under the conditions that existed. The dogs had worked the ground available to them. The soldiers had descended into the places that other searchers could not easily reach. The grid lines had been walked by people who were paying careful attention to what lay between them. And in the end, the forest at the edge of Spence Field, where a child had passed from an open meadow into the trees on a Father's Day afternoon, held no confirmed sign of where that child had gone. The case remained open when the search concluded, as it has remained open in the decades since. The search record became part of the case file, adding its documentation of extraordinary effort and absent result to the foundational facts of the disappearance itself: the date, the location, the family, the game that had sent a 6-year-old into the tree line, and the silence that had answered every call of his name from that first evening onward. What the search established, in the form of a documented finding, was that every method available and every resource deployed across a sustained and serious operation had not located Dennis Martin. That is what it established. The question of where he had gone and what had happened to him in the forest at the edge of the meadow remained exactly what it had been from the moment the other boys emerged from the trees, without him, open, unanswered, and held in the record with the careful attention that the absence of a resolution requires. The high ridges of the Smokies received the search and returned to themselves. The drainages below Spence Field, scoured by green berets descending toward Eagle Creek through rhododendron and cold water and moss-covered stone, resettled into their ordinary quiet. The trail that crossed Spence Field and continued along the state line ridge carried its ordinary traffic of summer hikers as it had before June 14th, and as it would in every June that followed. The meadow grass, which had been crossed and recrossed by searchers moving outward from the point where Dennis had last been seen, grew through the summer in the ordinary way of meadow grass, at high elevation, slowly, in the cool air, thickened by the frequent rain, restored to its unmarked green by the time the season had advanced far enough to put the search behind it. The search for Dennis Martin had been, by every measure available, as large and as serious and as well organized as anything the National Park System had mounted in the eastern United States in that period. The personnel involved had brought to it the full range of methods available to them. The terrain had been covered, sector by sector and drainage by drainage, across days and weeks of sustained effort, conducted in difficult conditions, and in a forest that did not yield its contents easily to any method of examination. What remained at the end of all of it was the documented record of what had been done and the equally documented fact of what had not been found. The two things together, the scale of the effort and the completeness of the absence, defined the search as it stood when the final teams left the back country and the formal operation was concluded. The file that held the search record remained open, as case files do when the search they document has ended without the finding it sought. The forest at Spence Field remained as it had been, the meadow open on the ridge, the trees beginning at its edges, the slopes descending in every direction into the deep and patient quiet of the southern Appalachian wilderness. On the afternoon of June 14th, 1969, a man named Harold Key was walking a trail in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park with members of his family. The trail ran through forested terrain near the corridor connecting Spence Field to the lower elevations of the park, and the afternoon light was already angling toward the longer shadows that come in the mountain hours before dusk. What Harold Key and his family encountered on that trail was not something they had expected, and not something they forgot. The account they gave to investigators in the days that followed described a man, large in their telling, visibly dirty, moving in a way that struck them as furtive, as though he were not walking the trail so much as keeping close to it from its edge. The account was documented. Investigators received it and treated it as a potentially significant piece of the record. It became one of the few pieces of testimony from June 14th, 1969, that named a specific human presence in the terrain around Spence Field at the time a 6-year-old boy had disappeared from its meadow. The Key family's account was not a casual report. What the family described, the size of the man, his apparent condition, the quality of his movement through the forest edge, was specific enough that investigators noted it with care and returned to it across the course of the investigation. Harold Key gave his account in a period when the search for Dennis Martin was still in its early days, and the terrain around Spence Field was crowded with rangers, volunteers, and military personnel. The presence of a man who did not fit the profile of a searcher, moving in a direction that could have carried him away from the search zone rather than toward it, was a detail that stood apart from the general noise of the investigation. The account placed a specific and unusual human figure in the landscape on the same afternoon a child had vanished, and in the record of what was reported and what was found, that detail held its own particular weight. What the investigation could not do, what the documentary record makes plain it was never able to do, was establish a confirmed connection between the man Harold Key described and Dennis Martin's disappearance. No individual matching that description was identified. No suspect was named. The account entered the case file as a documented witness report, which is the honest and precise category it occupied. Something seen, something recorded, something that could not be carried further by the evidence available. The record holds the Key family's testimony as it was given. The record does not hold a resolution that testimony made possible. A second report, separate from the Key family's account and originating from a different area of the terrain, added another layer to the documented evidence. A family in the Rowans Creek area, a location in the forested terrain below the park's high elevation ridges, in a direction consistent with drainage routes descending away from Spence Field, reported seeing a man carrying a child. The child in their account appeared dirty and disheveled. The child was not moving under his own power. Investigators noted the account and noted also that the location was several miles from Spence Field, and that the route between them, while long and physically demanding, was not impossible for a person moving through the drainage corridors and creek beds that descend from the high ridge. The Rowans Creek account was received as a serious report. It placed a child matching Dennis Martin's general description in terms of approximate size and apparent condition at a remove from the Spence Field search zone in a direction the investigation had not, at that point, covered with the same density of searchers as the terrain immediately adjacent to the meadow. What the account could not provide, and what the subsequent investigation was never able to establish, was a confirmed identification of the child or the man carrying him. The description of the child as unresponsive, as a body being carried rather than a person walking, was a detail investigators recorded. The investigation directed resources toward the Rowans Creek corridor after the report was received. Nothing that corroborated the account was recovered. These two witness reports, the Key family's encounter on the trail and the Rowans Creek family's sighting of a man with a child, represent the most significant human testimony in the primary record of Dennis Martin's disappearance. Both were taken seriously by investigators at the time. Both were followed as investigative leads for as long as those leads held. Neither produced a confirmed result. Neither was dismissed, and neither was proven. They rest in the case file in the condition that defines a great deal of the evidence in this case. Documented, credible in the sense that investigators assign them weight, and ultimately unable to be confirmed or extended beyond what the witnesses themselves reported seeing. On the evening of June 14, 1969, in the period after Dennis Martin failed to emerge from the Spence Field tree line, and before the full mobilization of a formal search operation, a number of people in the area of Spence Field and the nearby trail corridors reported hearing a sound from the forest. What they described was a scream, or a series of sounds consistent with screaming, and what several of those who heard it said afterward was that the sound had the quality of a child's voice. The reports came from more than one person in more than one position on the landscape around the meadow. The accounts agreed on the essential character of the sound, that it was loud enough to carry from within the forest, that it was not an animal sound in any way those witnesses recognized, and that it originated from a direction within the tree line rather than from the open bald itself. The sound was not recorded, and its source was not identified. Search efforts directed toward the area of the forest from which the screaming appeared to have come, an area investigators attempted to triangulate based on the positions of the witnesses who reported it, produced nothing. The forest, with its density of rhododendron and mountain laurel and old-growth canopy, did not yield the source of what those witnesses had heard. The reports entered the record alongside the Key family's account and the Rowans Creek sighting, each of them a documented piece of testimony, none of them capable of being confirmed beyond the fact of having been reported. The sound, as documented, was heard once, or perhaps as a brief series of sounds, and then was not heard again. Multiple witnesses agreed on this. Whatever had produced it did not continue. The forest returned to its ordinary evening quiet, and the search parties that entered the woods in the hours that followed found nothing that explained what those people had heard standing in the open grass of Spence Field. As the afternoon faded toward dusk on June 14, 1969, there is a particular kind of absence that defines a case at its evidentiary core, and in the Dennis Martin case, that absence is so complete and so consistent across such a long span of time that it constitutes a fact of its own, a documented condition of the record rather than merely a gap within it. The search that followed Dennis Martin's disappearance was not small. It was not brief. It was not conducted by untrained or unprepared personnel working with inadequate resources in difficult conditions. The personnel who moved through the terrain around Spence Field in the days and weeks after June 14, 1969, included some of the most capable wilderness searchers available in the eastern United States at the time. Trained rangers, military-grade trackers, experienced search dogs working fresh scent, and civilian woodsmen who knew the Smokies terrain with a familiarity that took years to develop. What those searchers found was not a partial trace. What they found was nothing. No clothing was recovered. No shoe, no sock, no piece of fabric that could be linked to the red and white striped shirt Dennis Martin had been wearing when his family last saw him duck into the tree line at Spence Field. No personal belonging, no item from his pockets, no fragment of any object a 6-year-old boy on a camping trip with his family might be expected to carry was found anywhere within the search zone. The bloodhounds that worked the scent trail from the meadow edge into the forest lost the thread or could not hold it in terrain where the rain that moved through the search zone in the hours and days after the disappearance had done what rain does to evidence laid on the open ground. The documented outcome of every organized search element that entered the forest around Spence Field was the same. No confirmed physical evidence of Dennis Martin's presence beyond the immediate boundary of the tree line where he had been seen to enter. The absence extended beyond the formal search period. In the months and years that followed the concentrated effort of June and July 1969, no physical trace was recovered. Hikers, rangers, and maintenance crews working the trails and drainages of the western Smokies in the decades after the disappearance encountered nothing. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 521,490 acres of terrain, more than 800 miles of maintained trail, an environment so thoroughly documented and so regularly traveled that its interior is among the most well-known wilderness landscapes in the eastern United States, gave nothing back. Not a bone, not a fragment of fabric, not a single artifact that could be placed in Dennis Martin's possession. In wilderness environments, complete absence of physical remains across a span of decades is documented by search and rescue and forensic professionals as statistically uncommon. The mountains hold what enters them. The Smokies, specifically, have a long documented history of retaining physical evidence, bones, clothing, equipment, across periods of years in conditions far more challenging than the comparatively accessible terrain surrounding Spence Field. The absence in the Dennis Martin case is not explained by the forest's ordinary capacity to conceal, decompose, or scatter material evidence. The absence is of a kind that investigators and researchers who have reviewed the case file have noted directly, without being able to account for it, and without offering an explanation the record is able to support. What the initial investigation established, or rather, what it was not able to establish, can be stated plainly and without embellishment. The point at which Dennis Martin entered the tree line at Spence Field was identified. The precise direction he moved from that point was not confirmed. No track was established beyond the immediate forest edge. No scent trail held long enough to indicate a direction of travel. the dogs that worked the terrain around Spence Field in the hours after the disappearance and in the organized search days that followed did not produce a confirmed lead. The search expanded outward from Spence Field in the absence of directional evidence, covering the drainages to the south toward Eagle Creek, the slopes toward Cades Cove to the north, and the trail corridors in every direction from the ridge. None of that expansion produced a confirmed finding. The documented record of the search is, in its own way, a form of evidence. What it shows is not simply that Dennis Martin was not found. What it shows is that a search of extraordinary scale and quality, directed by capable and experienced personnel, working in terrain they knew, using methods that had succeeded in previous wilderness searches in the same park, produced nothing at all. The record of the search's methods and the record of its results are two documents that, placed side by side, describe a gap between capability and outcome that the investigation itself was never able to explain. There is a specific detail in the documentary record that searchers and investigators who have followed this case over the years tend to return to, and it concerns the behavior of the trained dogs that worked the scent trail from the meadow edge in the first hours and days after the disappearance. The bloodhounds that were brought into the search zone were working on the kind of fresh scent trail that, under ordinary conditions in wilderness searches, dogs can follow reliably even after rain, even across rugged terrain, even when a subject has moved quickly through dense undergrowth. What the documented record of the dog work in this case describes is not a trail that went cold gradually, tapering from a strong lead to a weaker one as distance and time accumulated. What the record describes is a trail that was picked up at the tree line and then did not extend in any confirmed direction. The dogs worked. They circled. They did not hold a line. Investigators and researchers who have reviewed this detail have noted it without arriving at a consensus explanation. The rain that moved through the search zone on the evening of June 14th and in the days that followed is the most straightforward evidentiary explanation. Precipitation of the kind documented in the Smokies at that elevation in June can degrade a scent trail significantly. The timing of the rain in relation to the timing of the first dog work is noted in the case materials, and it is a reasonable and documented factor. It is also a factor that in other wilderness searches conducted under similar precipitation conditions has not reliably produced a complete absence of trackable scent across an entire terrain radius. What the dogs found at Spence Field was not a degraded trail. What they found was a boundary. The boundary at the tree line is in the evidence record the most consistent and in some ways the most carefully documented feature of the case. It is the last confirmed point. Everything before it, the family's arrival at Spence Field, the afternoon in the meadow, the game the boys devised, the moment Dennis crossed into the trees, exists in a detailed and verified record. Everything after it does not. The tree line at Spence Field is where the documented case ends and where the undocumented one begins, and the distance between those two states has not been closed in the 55 years since the afternoon of June 14, 1969. The physical evidence that was not found is, in its own category, as worth following as the evidence that was. A complete list of what was not recovered in the Dennis Martin case is short precisely because it is complete. No clothing, no remains, no footprint confirmed as his beyond the forest's immediate edge, no personal belonging, no biological material. In cases of this kind, wilderness disappearances involving a child in accessible terrain with a large organized search and sustained investigative attention over many years, the complete absence of physical trace is unusual enough that it has been noted formally, not as a dramatic observation, but as a documented characteristic of the case that distinguishes it within the broader record of missing persons in national park environments. What search and rescue professionals and forensic investigators have said about complete absence in wilderness cases is worth holding carefully without pressing it toward a conclusion. In the general record of wilderness disappearances, physical trace is almost always found eventually through subsequent hiking, trail maintenance, wildlife activity, or natural erosion processes that surface buried or concealed material over time. The terrain around Spence Field is not remote wilderness. The trails that pass through it are maintained and walked regularly. The drainages that descend from the ridge carry debris seasons after seasons and deposit it in places where hikers and maintenance crews would eventually encounter it. The documented fact that nothing has been found in 55 years of regular human use of that terrain is a fact that the record holds without an explanation adequate to it. The witness accounts, the Key family on the trail, the family in the Rowans Creek area, the multiple people who reported hearing a scream from the Spence Field tree line, exist in the same record that holds the absence of physical evidence. They are not the same kind of evidence. What witnesses reported seeing and hearing on June 14, 1969, is documentation of human perception under specific conditions, and human perception under those conditions is valuable and fallible in equal measure. The investigators who received those accounts understood this. They documented the reports. They followed them as investigative leads. They did not treat any of them as confirmed fact, and the record does not record them as anything beyond what they were. Accounts given by credible people who believed they had seen or heard something relevant to what had happened at Spence Field that afternoon. The man Harold Key described on the trail, large, dirty, moving furtively, was never identified. No investigation was able to place a specific individual at that location on June 14, 1969, in a manner that would establish a confirmed connection to Dennis Martin's disappearance. The man the Rowans Creek family reported seeing with a child was never identified. The child he was carrying was never confirmed as Dennis Martin or as anyone else. The scream witnesses reported from the Spence Field tree line was never sourced. Each of these reports is real in the sense that it was given, received, and documented by investigators who treated it with appropriate seriousness. None of these reports is real in the sense of having been independently confirmed by physical evidence, by corroboration from additional witnesses, or by any subsequent investigative finding that extended their implications. What the case file holds in this section of its record is a cluster of documented accounts arranged around a documented absence. The accounts give shape to a space the investigation could not fully enter. The absence defines the limits of what investigation, however thorough and however well-resourced, was able to establish. Together, they describe a case whose evidentiary record is simultaneously full of reported detail and empty of the physical confirmation that would give that detail a place in a verified account of what happened to Dennis Martin after he stepped into the trees at Spence Field at somewhere between 4:30 and 5 o'clock on the afternoon of Father's Day, 1969. The case file is a physical object, or was, in its original form, pages of ranger reports, witness statements, search logs, transcribed interviews, and investigative notes assembled across the first weeks and months of the investigation and supplemented in the years that followed by periodic reviews, additional interviews, and correspondence related to the ongoing missing persons classification. The file grew over time. New reports were added when they were submitted. New interviews were conducted when new witnesses came forward. The file does not have a closing entry. It has a most recent entry, which is different. a document that reflects not the end of something, but the continuation of a record that has not been resolved and therefore cannot be closed. What a case file of this kind contains, examined across the full span of its documentation, is two distinct records running alongside each other. One record is the record of what was reported and investigated, the witness accounts, the search operations, the forensic findings, the investigative theories, and the effort expended to test them. The other record is the record of what those reports and investigations did not establish, the confirmed track not found, the physical evidence not recovered, the suspect not named, the explanation not arrived at. In the Dennis Martin case, both of those records are long, both of them are detailed, and both of them are, as of the most recent documentation available, still open. There is a quality that belongs to cases where the evidentiary record is this complete in its documentation and this incomplete in its resolution. And it is not the quality of suspense, because suspense requires the possibility of a reveal that the record does not hold. The quality is closer to the specific kind of attention that a long and careful case invites, the attention that comes from following every documented element to the limit it can be followed, and then sitting with the honest acknowledgement that the limit has been reached, and that what lies beyond it is not documented and cannot at present be known. The witnesses who gave their accounts to investigators in June and July of 1969 are part of the record now, in the way that all documented testimony becomes part of the record, fixed in the form it was given, available for review, honest about what it can and cannot establish. Harold Key and his family walked a trail on a June afternoon and saw a man they felt compelled to describe to investigators afterward, and that description is in the file. The family in the Rowans Creek area saw a man carrying a child and reported it, and that report is in the file. The people standing in the Spencefield meadow at dusk heard something from the forest and later described it as the sound of a child screaming, and those accounts are in the file. None of those people fabricated what they told investigators. None of their accounts was dismissed. None of their accounts in the decades since they were given has been confirmed or refuted by physical evidence. The screams reported from the forest on the evening of June 14th are perhaps the most quietly persistent detail in the primary record. The people who heard them were standing in the open, in a position that would have given them reasonable acoustic access to sounds from the surrounding tree line. More than one person reported the sound independently. The descriptions were consistent enough that investigators treated the reports as credible. What the record cannot do is locate the source of what was heard, connect it to a confirmed physical event, or place it in a verified sequence of events following Dennis Martin's entry into the trees. The sound was heard. The forest that produced it gave no further account of itself. The searchers who entered the woods in the direction from which the sound appeared to have come found nothing that explained it. These are the limits of the documented record. They are stated here not because the limits are themselves the point, but because the limits are where honest engagement with a case like this one ultimately arrives. The investigation did not fail through lack of effort, or lack of expertise, or lack of resources. The investigation reached the edges of what the physical evidence and the witness testimony could support. And beyond those edges, the record has nothing to show. That is the condition of the case as documented, and it is a condition that no subsequent review, however thorough, has materially altered. In the long accumulation of case materials, the ranger reports from the nights of June 14th and 15, the search logs from the days that followed, the interview transcripts, the records of the dog work, the accounts of the military personnel who worked the steep drainages below Spencefield, the investigative notes on the Key family's report, and the Rowans Creek sighting, What is present is enormous. What those materials collectively document is a case that received sustained attention from capable and serious people who wanted to find Dennis Martin and were not able to. The file records their effort with precision. It records their results with equal precision. It does not record a resolution because no resolution was reached. The meadow at Spence Field and the tree line at its edge and the exact point where a 6-year-old boy in a red and white striped shirt stepped out of sight and into the forest on a June afternoon. These are the physical anchors of a case whose evidentiary record is exact at one end and completely open at the other. What is known precisely: who was present, what time of day it was, what the boy was doing, what he was wearing, which direction he moved, and the fact that he did not come out of the trees as expected. What is not known at all, not approximately, not inferentially, not through the accumulation of circumstantial evidence into something resembling a conclusion. The record is exact at one end and empty at the other, and the distance between those two conditions is the full extent of what the case has preserved. The people who reported what they saw and heard on June 14, 1969, gave their accounts to investigators who wrote them down carefully, and those accounts have been read by investigators and researchers and curious members of the public across the decades since. The search parties who moved through the forest around Spence Field in the days and weeks after the disappearance covered ground that had not been covered before and has not been searched again with the same intensity since. The dogs that worked the scent trail from the meadow edge worked it under conditions that were difficult and with results that were documented honestly. All of that effort, all of that testimony, all of that careful and sustained attention directed into the forest around Spence Field across the summer of 1969 and into the years that followed is present in the case file in the form in which it was recorded. What the case file does not contain is a page that explains where Dennis Martin went. That page was never written because the information it would have required was never found. The physical evidence that would have made that page possible was never recovered. No shoe, no bone, no fragment of red and white fabric, no footprint in the mud of a creek drainage, no disturbed patch of forest floor that could be assigned to a specific event on a specific afternoon. Indeed, no object of any kind that could be held up and confirmed as belonging to the 6-year-old boy who entered the Spence Field tree line and did not come out. The file contains everything the investigation was able to assemble, and the absence of that final page is part of the file too, the gap that defines the case as clearly as any piece of testimony or any documented investigative finding. The record exists. The accounts within it exist. The absence at its center exists in the same way, documented, precise, and unchanged by the years that have passed since the afternoon it began. What Harold Key saw on the trail, what the Rowans Creek family saw in the wooded valley below the ridge, what the people in the Spence Field meadow heard from the trees at dusk, all of it is held in the file in the form in which it was given, patient and exact, the way a careful record holds everything it contains and marks clearly the edges where what it contains ends and what it does not begin. The tree line is still there, at the edge of the open bald, exactly where it was on June 14, 1969, and the case file is still open, its final entry not yet written, the record of what was reported and what was never found, continuing to exist in the form it has held for more than 50 years. Neither resolved nor closed, simply there, the way a careful and unfinished record is simply there, present in the file, waiting in the way that unresolved things wait, without urgency, without end. The Dennis Martin case has never been formally closed. That fact exists in the National Park Service's official records, a designation of missing person, a cause of disappearance listed as unconfirmed, a file that has accumulated pages across more than 5 decades without arriving at a final entry. The case is open in the same way it has always been open, held in the same administrative category it was placed in during the weeks after June 1969, when the search teams came down from the ridges and the mountain returned to its ordinary quiet. There is something particular about an official record that has remained in this condition for more than 50 years. It is not the same as an investigation that was abandoned or a file that was sealed with a notation of insufficient evidence. The Dennis Martin case remains active in the sense that the National Park Service has never attached a formal determination of cause to the disappearance, not animal attack, not accident, not abduction, not any other designation that would allow the record to be marked complete and archived. What the file contains is what it has always contained, and what it does not contain is the single piece of documentation that would allow it to be considered finished. For the Martin family, the formal status of the case was never the most important thing. Bill Martin and Clyde Martin and the other family members who were present at Spence Field on June 14, 1969, carried the weight of that afternoon in a way that no administrative classification could modify or resolve. What the record shows about the family in the years following the disappearance is consistent with what the record tends to show about families in similar circumstances: a persistent hope, a continued attention to any development that might surface, a life lived alongside an absence that never closed. The official record holds the case open as a technical matter. The families of the missing hold cases open in a different way entirely, and that holding requires no paperwork. The years immediately following the search were a period in which the case remained active in the public record. Newspaper accounts from the summer of 1969 documented the scale of the search operation and the absence of its result. The Knoxville Press followed the story through the summer months, and the disappearance was noted in regional reporting as an event that had occupied an extraordinary quantity of resource and personnel, and returned nothing definitive. In the early 1970s, as the immediate urgency of the search faded and the investigation entered what might be described as a quieter phase, the case moved out of regular public attention while remaining in the official files of the National Park Service and cooperating law enforcement agencies. The quiet phase of an unresolved missing persons case is itself a documented phenomenon in investigative records. It is the period in which the active teams have been stood down. The immediate search zone has been exhausted, and the case is maintained rather than pursued. Reviewed when new information arrives, assigned to a cold case designation if one exists in the relevant jurisdiction, and held against the possibility that something recoverable may eventually surface. For the Dennis Martin case, this period extended across much of the 1970s and 1980s. The file present in the system, the case not forgotten by those who worked it, the mountain returning each season to the ordinary condition of a park receiving several million visitors per year. The terrain around Spence Field did not change in any significant way across those decades. The grassy bald remained at its elevation of approximately 4,900 feet, bordered on all sides by the same dense forest that searchers entered in June 1969 and emerged from without the thing they were looking for. The Appalachian Trail continued to run through the meadow as it has run through it since the trail was completed in that section, and hikers continued to pass through Spence Field in the numbers that a well-traveled backcountry destination in one of the most visited national parks in the country tends to receive. The meadow in June in any given year after 1969 looked broadly as it had looked on the afternoon. The Martin family spent there, the grass open to the mountain light, the tree line beginning sharply at the edges of the bald, the sky above the ridge, the particular quality of sky that high elevation terrain produces on a clear June afternoon. The physical place continued to exist in exactly the form it had always existed, holding no mark of what had happened there. It was in the early 2010s, Seth, that the Dennis Martin case entered a new phase of public attention, one that brought it before a substantially wider audience than regional Tennessee reporting had ever reached. David Paulides, a former law enforcement officer who had turned his attention to the study of unusual disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas, included the Dennis Martin case as a prominent example in his Missing 411 series of publications. The first books in that series appeared around 2011 and 2012, and Paulides produced a documentary film in 2016 that examined several cases from his research, with the Dennis Martin disappearance among the cases given extended attention. The framework Paulides applied across the Missing 411 project was built around what he described as patterns in wilderness, disappearances, specific features that he argued appeared with unusual frequency in cases that shared certain characteristics. These features, as Paulides documented them, included the failure of trained search dogs to establish and follow a scent trail, the complete absence of physical remains or personal belongings, even after intensive searches, the presence of rain or other weather events in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, and the proximity of the missing person to a particular type of terrain, features such as water, boulder fields, or dense vegetation. The Dennis Martin case in Paulides' account presented several of these features in concentrated form. The dogs that lost the scent in the rain-washed terrain below Spence Field, the absence of any recovered material across decades, the weather that moved through the search zone in the hours after the disappearance, the dense rhododendron thickets and steep drainages immediately adjacent to the meadow where Dennis was last seen. It is important to hold the Missing 411 framework as what it is, a documented perspective applied to the case by a specific researcher, not a conclusion established by formal investigation. Paulides' work drew genuine public attention to a set of disappearances that had not previously been examined together, and his inclusion of the Dennis Martin case introduced the story to readers and viewers who had no prior knowledge of the 1969 search. Whether his analytical framework represents a meaningful pattern in the cases he examined, or whether it represents the selection of features that conform to a pre-existing interpretive structure, is a question that remains in legitimate dispute among those who have engaged with his work. What the Missing 411 project did, in documentable terms, was return the Dennis Martin case to wide public attention for the first time since the original news coverage of the search, and it placed that case before an audience that would continue to engage with it through the subsequent decade. The animal attack theory has occupied a particular position in informal discussions of the Dennis Martin case across many years. Some national park officials and others familiar with wilderness disappearances have cited this explanation as a plausible account of how a 6-year-old child in the Smoky Mountains could vanish without leaving recoverable physical evidence, the reasoning being that predator attacks can, in certain circumstances, result in the rapid removal of a small victim into difficult terrain, with subsequent decomposition and dispersal of remains further reducing the likelihood of recovery in a densely forested environment. The park maintained a population of several hundred American black bears in 1969, and wild boar were also established in the area around Spence Field by that time. The difficulty with the animal attack theory as investigators and researchers have consistently noted, is the same difficulty that applies to any explanatory framework proposed for this case. The absence of physical evidence cuts against the theory rather than confirming it. Fatal predator attacks, even in wilderness environments, typically produce some recoverable material. Clothing is distributed, bones are scattered, something remains in the terrain that a sufficiently thorough search can eventually locate. The Dennis Martin search was by most measures one of the most thorough wilderness searches conducted in the national park system in the 1960s. Hundreds of personnel, trained dogs, experienced trackers, military involvement, extended duration, and it recovered nothing. A spontaneous predator attack in the terrain adjacent to Spence Field is not an explanation that the evidentiary record can confirm or rule out, and it remains where all explanations in this case remain, which is in the space of unconfirmed possibility. The abduction theory has similarly persisted across decades without achieving the status of a confirmed investigative conclusion. The testimony given by Harold Key and his family, the account of a large, dirty, furtive man observed on the trail corridor near Spence Field on June 14, 1969, was taken seriously by investigators at the time and has remained a significant point of reference in discussions of the case. A separate family's report of a man carrying a child in the Rowans Creek area added a further dimension to this line of inquiry, placing a figure consistent with some features of the Key family's account at a location several miles from Spence Field and in a direction that drainage routes from the ridge would naturally favor. The screams that multiple witnesses reported hearing from the forest on the evening of June 14th were also considered in the context of the abduction theory, as a child's cry would be consistent with the account of a person in distress in the forest below the meadow. None of this resolved into a confirmed investigative finding. No suspect was identified, named, or charged in connection with Dennis Martin's disappearance. The man observed by the Key family was never located or identified to the satisfaction of investigators. Law enforcement agencies that reviewed the case across subsequent decades were unable to establish a confirmed link between any known individual and the events of June 14, 1969. The abduction theory rests on documented witness testimony that was considered credible at the time and has not been disproved by any subsequent investigation, but testimony considered credible and testimony confirmed as accurate by physical or forensic evidence are different categories of documentation, and the Dennis Martin case has always occupied a space between them. What the decades of continued attention to this case have produced, in documentable terms, is a detailed and publicly available record of everything that was reported, everything that was searched, and everything that was not found. The case file, the ranger reports, the witness statements, the search logs, the investigative notes accumulated across the summer of 1969 and beyond represents a significant body of primary documentation for a wilderness disappearance of this period. Cases of comparable duration and resource deployment were not common in the national park system in the 1960s, and the administrative record of the Dennis Martin search is correspondingly detailed. That record does not resolve the case. It does establish with considerable precision what was known, what was attempted, and what remained unanswered at each stage of the investigation. Across the 2010s and into the 2020s, communities of people engaged with the Dennis Martin case have maintained their attention to it through online platforms, dedicated discussion forums, true crime communities, annual reflections published around the anniversary of the disappearance each June. The case has attracted consistent engagement in spaces where detailed investigation of unresolved disappearances is a regular collective activity, and those communities have produced extensive reviews of the primary documentation, the witness testimony, and the range of explanatory frameworks that have been applied to the case across 50 years. What this ongoing attention has not produced is a piece of evidence or a confirmed finding that changes the fundamental condition of the case, which is that the record remains open and the central question remains unanswered. The anniversary of Dennis Martin's disappearance falls each year on June 14th. The terrain around Spence Field in the second week of June has a particular quality: the high elevation summer just arriving, the meadow grass growing back to its full June height, the tree line in full leaf, the trail visible across the open bald, and then disappearing into the forest at the edges of the ridge. Hikers who make the climb to Spence Field each June pass through the same terrain that was searched by hundreds of people in 1969, and many of them know the story of the disappearance and consider it as they walk the trail and cross the open meadow. The meadow does not hold any visible mark of what happened there. The grass grows the same way it grew before. The tree line begins at the same distance from the center of the bald. The forest beyond it is the same dense, indifferent forest it has always been. There is a version of attention to an unresolved case that looks for the answer, the missing piece of evidence, the witness who has not yet been found, the database that has not yet been searched, the physical location that has not yet been examined. That attention is productive and legitimate, and the people who direct it at the Dennis Martin case are doing something that the record itself invites. The file is open, the designation is missing, not confirmed dead, not archived. The technical possibility exists that something might surface that would move the case toward a resolution it has not achieved in more than 50 years. There is another version of attention to a case like this one, which is simply holding it carefully, following the documented record through its stages, noting what was found and what was not, sitting with the particular shape of an absence that has persisted across decades without being filled. This version of attention does not produce an answer. It produces something else, which is a precise and honest sense of what the record actually contains and what it does not, and what that difference means for the people who have carried this case through the years since 1969. The National Park Service's designation of Dennis Martin as a missing person with no confirmed cause of disappearance is a classification that carries administrative weight and almost no explanatory content. It says that the system that handles such matters has not determined what happened, and that it continues to hold the case against the possibility that a determination may eventually be possible. The classification does not reflect any judgment about the likelihood of that possibility. It simply records the case as it stands, open, unconfirmed, maintained. Among the people for whom that administrative designation is most consequential are those who were present at Spence Field on June 14, 1969, the members of the Martin family who were there, who began calling Dennis's name at the tree line in the late afternoon, who watched the search operation deploy across the mountain and then contract again without finding him. What the record holds of their experience in the years following the disappearance is limited by the nature of the record itself, which tends to document investigative events rather than the interior lives of the people those events involved. What can be said is that the case they lived through was one for which no formal resolution was ever provided, and that the open administrative status of the file reflects in its own restrained way the open condition in which they were left. The Smoky Mountains in the years since 1969 have received hundreds of millions of visitors. The park has maintained its designation as one of the most visited in the national park system, and the backcountry, the trails above the visitor centers, The high ridges and balds and drainages has continued to draw hikers in numbers that make the wilderness feel, at the most popular trailheads, rather less solitary than the word wilderness suggests. Spence Field is not the most accessible destination in the park, requiring a significant climb from the nearest trailhead, but it is a well-known point on the Appalachian Trail corridor, and the meadow at the top of the ridge is a recognizable landmark to people familiar with the backcountry in that part of the park. The search for Dennis Martin was the largest wilderness search and rescue operation in the park's history at the time it occurred. That record may have been surpassed in subsequent decades, as search and rescue methodology has developed and the capacity to deploy resources into wilderness areas has grown. What has not changed is the basic condition of the terrain that received the search: the same drainages below the ridge, the same rhododendron thickets at mid-elevation, the same steep slopes that required the Green Beret soldiers to use their hands as they descended toward Eagle Creek in June 1969. The forest does not keep a record of what passed through it. It grows the way it has always grown, indifferent to whether a search was conducted in it or not, returning each spring to the same density and depth it presents each other spring. The persistence of the Dennis Martin case in public attention across more than 50 years is itself a documentable fact about how certain unresolved disappearances move through time. Cases that produce no physical evidence, no confirmed explanation, and no formal closure occupy a particular position in collective memory. They are neither resolved into the past by a known outcome, nor forgotten entirely, but held in a condition of continuing openness that invites periodic return. People come back to the Dennis Martin case because the record invites it. The file is there. The documentation is detailed. The question is exactly as it was in June 1969. What happened? In what direction? In those first minutes after a 6-year-old boy stepped from the open meadow into the tree line and did not come back. That question has not moved toward an answer across the years. This is not a failure of investigation in the simple sense. The resources deployed were extraordinary for the period. The tracking expertise brought to bear was considerable. The personnel count was among the highest recorded for a wilderness search and rescue effort in the national park system in the 1960s. The absence of an answer reflects something about the terrain and the conditions and the fundamental limit of what a search, however well organized and extensively resourced, can find in a forest that has not chosen to yield what it holds. The Smokies are a large and specific place, and the area around Spence Field in particular is the kind of terrain that can receive a search of that magnitude and return it empty without any particular explanation for why. What the case file holds, in its current form, is the accumulation of everything that was documented across 55 years of open status: the initial ranger reports, the witness statements from the Key family, and the Rowans Creek family, and the hikers who reported hearing screams, the search logs, the tracking notes, the records of the military deployment, the accounts of Tom Burnett and the other civilian trackers who worked the terrain, and the successive layers of review that followed as the case moved through the decades without closing. Each of those documents was produced by a specific person at a specific time in response to a specific event or finding. Together, they constitute a record that is among the more detailed available for a wilderness disappearance of this period. Detailed not because it resolves the question, but because so many people worked so hard and so carefully to try. The mountain in June holds its light longer than it does at other times of year. The high elevation evenings come slowly in summer, the sky staying luminous above the open balds and ridges, while the forest below gathers its shadows earlier. On a clear June evening, The meadow at Spence Field would have been visible for some time after the sun dropped behind the western ridges, the open grass still catching light, while the tree line at its edges moved into shade. The afternoon on June 14th, 1969, was followed by rain, and the weather that moved through the search zone in the hours and days after the disappearance is part of the documented record of the case. Rain that came down across the ridge and into the drainages, washing the ground, settling the disturbed earth, leaving the forest in the particular quiet that follows high elevation storm activity. That rain is part of what the case holds. It is documented in the search logs and in the accounts of the personnel who worked the terrain in the days following June 14th, and it represents one of the concrete material reasons that the search found so little to follow. The scent trails degraded, the soft ground reset, the forest returned by the weather to a condition that did not distinguish between the ground a missing child had crossed and the ground no one had crossed at all. Rain in the Smokies at high elevation is not a dramatic fact. It is simply a characteristic of the environment. The park receives considerable precipitation across all seasons, and the summer storm activity in the high country is consistent with the conditions the search encountered. But as a documented element of the case, it carries weight because it was among the factors that made an already difficult search effectively impossible by the time the full scale of the operation was deployed. The Appalachian Trail passes through Spence Field and continues along the state line ridge in both directions, northeast toward the Thunderhead Mountain area, southwest toward other high points on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Hikers who walk that section of the trail in any summer season pass through the meadow and continue on without knowing, in most cases, the specific history of the place. Some do know. Some have read the accounts of the disappearance or followed the online discussions that return to the case each June, and they arrive at Spence Field with the specific knowledge of what happened there and a corresponding attention to the tree line at the meadow's edges. What they find in every season is the meadow as it has always been. The grass open, the trail visible across the bald, the forest beginning at the same boundary where it has always begun. There is nothing in the physical place that marks June 14th, 1969, as distinct from any other day in the meadow's long history. The grass grows over the place where the search began. The tree line at the edge of the bald holds no visible record of the moment a child stepped through it and did not come back. This is the nature of these places. They continue to exist in their ordinary form, regardless of what has happened in them, and the events they have witnessed are not written in them in any way that the physical landscape preserves. The Dennis Martin case exists in its entirety in the documents that recorded it, in the case file held by the National Park Service and cooperating agencies, in the newspaper accounts published in the summer of 1969, in the investigative records maintained by law enforcement, in the research compiled by those who have reviewed the case in subsequent decades, in the witness statements that were taken down and typed and filed and have remained available for review across all the years since. The case is exactly as documented. The record neither confirms more than was established at the time, nor forgets what was established. It persists in the form it was given, open at the end, its final pages blank. Cases that remain in this condition across 5 decades have a particular quality in the record. They are not the same as cold cases where a suspect was identified and could not be charged, or cases where the evidence was lost or degraded beyond utility, or cases where a victim's fate is understood even if the responsible party is unknown. They are cases where the most basic question, what happened to this person, has never been answered, and where the accumulation of investigation and attention across decades has not moved that question toward resolution. The Dennis Martin case belongs in this category, and it has occupied it for longer than most cases of comparable profile remain unresolved. The mountain does not change in any essential way across the years. The terrain around Spence Field in June 2024 is recognizably the same terrain it was in June 1969. The same elevation, the same orientation on the state line ridge, the same pattern of open, bald, and dense forest that has characterized that location since before the park was established. The drainages below the ridge still descend steeply toward Eagle Creek and toward the Cades Cove side of the mountain. The rhododendron thickets at mid-elevation still close around anyone who moves through them, reducing visibility to the space immediately available between one set of branches and the next. The creek bottoms are still cold and shaded, even in the warmest weeks of summer. The forest is still exactly what it was, large, indifferent, and entirely capable of receiving whatever moves into it without offering any account of what passed through. This is not a forest that withholds information in any meaningful sense. 'Tis simply a place of considerable size and density that does not preserve the kind of record that human investigation requires. The leaf litter on the forest floor does not remember footsteps. The rhododendron branches do not retain the shape of what has passed through them. The rain washes the surface of things and leaves them as they were before the rain. The forest is as it is, and what moves through it moves through without leaving a permanent account. The Dennis Martin case file, wherever it is held in the National Park Service system, is the only account that remains. It does not tell what happened. It tells what was reported, what was searched, what was found, and what was not found. And in telling those things, it establishes the boundary of what is actually known, a boundary that has not moved since the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. When the search teams came off the mountain and the investigation moved from active search to the longer, quieter condition of an open missing persons case, the file has that condition. It has held it for more than 50 years. Spence Field, in the early morning of a June day, is a particular kind of quiet